Welcome to this WiseL Excel VBA tutorial. In this video we'll explain how to connect to a SQL Server database using ActiveX Data Objects, or ADO for short. This is intended as an update to earlier videos in the series, just to cover some of the recent changes to SQL Server database drivers. So we'll start by reminding you how to reference the ActiveX Data Objects library, and then we'll use that to create a new connection object. We'll then very briefly cover the history of SQL Server drivers, mainly to explain all about the new Microsoft MSOLEDBSQL driver for SQL Server. We'll talk about how to install that, and then how to use that driver to write a connection string to connect to a SQL Server database. Once we've done that, we'll use a Recordset to retrieve some basic data from the database, and then finally write that data out to a worksheet in Excel. So let's get started. Just before we get into writing some code, it's worthwhile mentioning that we do already have some videos in the Excel VBA playlist which explain how to connect to databases, both for Microsoft Access and for SQL Server. Now these videos have been up for quite a while, so although the techniques shown in there are still relevant and useful, there have been some changes since they were uploaded, particularly in terms of connecting to a SQL Server database. And this video is going to explain what those changes are and how you write new code to connect to SQL Server. If you want to follow along with exactly what I'm doing, you'll need access to an instance of SQL Server, and we have a couple of playlists which explain how to get started with a free edition of Microsoft SQL Server. So there's one for SQL Server 2017, and there's an older one for SQL Server 2016. You'll also need access to a sample database, and the example I'm going to use for this video is the WiseL Movies database. You can grab a copy of a script that will allow you to install that database from this video, and I'll pop a link in the description of this video as well, so you can easily get hold of it from there. So assuming you're ready to go, what I've done is opened up a brand new blank Excel workbook, and from there we can head into the Developer tab of the ribbon and open up the Visual Basic Editor, and then insert a new blank module into the project and get ready to write some code to connect to SQL Server. To help us with writing the code, we'll set a reference to the Microsoft ActiveX Data Objects library, or ADO for short. To do that, we can head to the Tools menu and choose References, and then when the dialog box appears, we can scroll down through the list to find Microsoft ActiveX Data Objects. You should find several versions of those installed on a modern machine. We're going to go with the latest version available, the 6.1 library, so Microsoft ActiveX Data Objects 6.1. Make sure you check the box next to it, don't just highlight it in the list, and then click OK. And that provides the IntelliSense with lots of information about various objects related to connecting to databases. If you want to have a very quick look at what new classes you have access to, you can head to the View menu and choose Object Browser. And then when that appears, you can click on the drop-down list where it says All Libraries and limit that to the ADODB library. This is the one you've just set a reference to. So a couple of classes that we're going to use in this video, we're going to use the connection class to connect to a database, and we'll also use the Recordset class, which will allow us to return a set of results and then write those out into a worksheet, just to prove that our connection is working properly. So having done that, I'm just going to close down the object browser to head back to the module, and then let's write a subroutine, call it connect to SQL Server. The first thing we'll do in the subroutine is declare a variable which can hold a reference to a connection object. I'll call mine CN, but feel free to give yours a more descriptive name if you like. To refer to the library we've just referenced, we can say ADODB, followed by a full stop, and then look for the connection class in that library. We'll then need to create a new instance of the connection class, so we can say set CN to be equal to a new ADODB.connection. And then we can begin setting properties and using methods of the connection object by saying cn dot. Probably the single most important property of a connection is referred to as the connection string. And this contains all sorts of information about how to connect to a particular database. So it contains information about which driver to use, which server the database is contained on, the name of the database, any credentials like a username and password. So it contains an awful lot of information. For now, what we'll do is just enter a pair of double quotes and then look at where we can go to find more information about connection strings. A fairly obvious place to start with this is with a quick Google search for connection strings, and that will inevitably lead you to good old connectionstrings.com. So if I just follow this link to head to that website, this is your go-to reference for connection strings for all sorts of databases, not just for SQL Server or even for Microsoft products. If you have a look at the list on the left-hand side here, the Connect To list, you can use connection strings to connect to all sorts of different data source types. And of course, this video is about SQL Server specifically, so in this list I'm going to look for the SQL Server item and then click on that link to see the whole host of different possible connection strings for SQL Server. Now, although we have a lot of choice here, we can eliminate some of these options immediately. For example, the .NET libraries. We're not programming in a .NET language like Visual C# or Visual Basic.NET, so we can cross these ones off the list, and likewise the .NET options on the right-hand side here. The MS Datashape option, I've never used that, and I've just had to look at what it is. Apparently it's been deprecated by Microsoft and will be removed from a later version of Windows, so don't use that one either. That leaves us with a choice between OLEDB providers and ODBC drivers. Now, you'll find plenty of websites which compare these two in huge amounts of detail, but very roughly speaking for this video, ODBC, Open Database Connectivity, is a generic technology for connecting to data sources. It's not a Microsoft-specific thing. You'll find this outside the Windows environment. So think of it almost like the lowest common denominator for connecting to a database. Pretty much any database you can think of will provide an ODBC driver to connect to it. Now, although it works, and I've used it in the past to connect to SQL Server, I have had a couple of issues with certain data types. For instance, nvarchar max. The ODBC driver doesn't work quite properly with that, or at least that, in my experience, that's the case. So we're going to use the OLEDB providers for this particular video. OLEDB, Object Linking and Embedding Database. But this is a specific Microsoft technology, so you won't find every single database type in the world providing an OLEDB provider. But as we're working with SQL Server, which of course is a Microsoft product, OLEDB goes hand in hand with SQL Server and ADO, ActiveX data objects. Now we have to choose which specific OLEDB provider to go for. And in order to understand which one to pick, you kind of need to know a little bit about the driver history for SQL Server. Unfortunately, Microsoft have this wonderful page, Driver History for Microsoft SQL Server. Not the most exciting article you will ever read, but kind of useful for us at this point in the video. So it starts with a discussion of ODBC drivers. We can skip through those to the OLEDB section. Then it describes 3 separate generations of OLEDB provider. The first one there, Microsoft OLEDB provider for SQL Server, or SQL OLEDB. This comes along with Windows, and you'll still find it installed as part of Windows. So if you've got Windows installed, you can use this provider. It will be there and available to you. However, it's a bit old-fashioned and out of date, so it has been deprecated and it's not recommended for new development. It is linked to on the SQL Server connection strings page, so I've got Microsoft OLEDB provider for SQL Server. If I click on that, it will show me some specific examples of connection strings using that provider. I'll just click back to go back to the main page. And there's a separate page about the Microsoft OLEDB provider for SQL Server. But again, it tells you this important message that it has been deprecated and is not recommended for new development work. So after that was released, they had this SQL Server native client OLEDB provider. Now this is the version we used in the earlier videos in this series. So it's called SQL NCLI, short for native client. And again, SQL Server Connection Strings has a couple of different SQL Server native client versions. This was the one we used in the previous videos, version number 11, and we've got some specific examples of connection strings using that provider here. I'll just click back to go back to the main page. Now this provider comes along with SQL Server. So if you install SQL Server 2012, 2014, 2016, 2017, it comes along with the SQL Server native client. It includes both a provider for OLEDB and a driver for ODBC as well. But again, if I look at the SQL Server native client page, or I look at the driver history, it tells me that this was deprecated in 2011, and it wasn't recommended to use that new driver for development for many years, and it tells you that on the SQL Server native client page here as well. So at that point, Microsoft were going to drop the OLEDB providers entirely, and they weren't going to provide a new version of the OLEDB provider at all. But they had a change of heart, and in 2018 they released a new Microsoft OLEDDB provider for SQL Server. And basically, it was an undeprecated version of the original one that they released. So they basically did a complete about turn, 180 degrees, and released a new version of this provider. There's a separate page for it altogether. It's confusingly got a very, very similar name, Microsoft OLEDDB driver for SQL Server, rather than Microsoft OLEDDB provider for SQL Server. So be very careful about which web pages you read for information about this. Make sure it's the modern, up-to-date version, the OLEDDB driver for SQL Server. Now, one small problem with this new driver for SQL Server is that although it's the recommended one to use, it doesn't actually ship with SQL Server currently. It was kind of released out of sync. It was released in between SQL Server 2017 and the soon-to-be released SQL Server 2019. So if you want to install it, you have to install it separately to SQL Server. So fortunately, there's a little quick download link here I can click on, and that will take me away to a separate page that I can click on to download the most recent version of this driver. So I can click on that, and then it will take me to the actual download page. It's not a particularly big file. I can click the download button, choose the 32-bit or the 64-bit version of the driver. I'm running a 64-bit edition of Windows with a 64-bit installation of SQL Server, so I'll go with the 64-bit driver. So I'll check that box and then click Next. And then the file will download. As I say, it's not a very big file, just 5.3 megabytes. And then when that's downloaded, I can click on the file to launch the installer. And it'll take me through a little wizard asking me to install it, choose to accept the license terms. I better read them nice and quickly. Done. And accept the license terms and click Next. Choose which bits you want to install. So I'm going to go with the driver itself. I'm not going to install the software development kit. And then I can click Next. And then I can click the install button, and away it will go and install that new driver. I might have to confirm this with a little pop-up. And if it looks like this is going to take a long time, I'll just pause the video here and come back when this is finished installing. Okay, so that's all done. All I need to do now is click the Finish button to complete the installation of the driver. Now we can look at how we can actually write a connection string which uses our new driver to connect to our SQL Server database. The next small problem is that, sadly, connectionstrings.com lets us down at this point, as they don't currently have an entry for the new OLEDDB driver for SQL Server. So to find out how to build a connection string, you've got a couple of choices. If I just go back to where I was before, if I go back a couple of pages, back to the information about the new driver for SQL Server. If I scroll downwards, I get another little bit of history here about the various different generations of OLEDDB drivers. And then if I get down to this little note here, it does give me a quick clue that if I have any old connection strings which use the original SQL OLEDDB or the SQL native client, I can just change those provider names to the new one, MSOLEDBSQL. So if you already have some old connection strings, or you have connectionstrings.com, which shows you how to, for example, use the SQL Server native client connection string, you could just replace the SQL NCLI11 with the new MSOLEDBSQL provider name instead. If you want a complete example of a connection string using that new driver, the announcement from Microsoft when they were announcing this new driver has some examples down here as well. So if I scroll down the page here, you can find how to convert from native client to the new OLEDDB driver there. So it's entirely up to you whether you copy this from connectionstrings.com and then modify it, or you find this announcing the release of OLEDDB driver for SQL Server and just copy and paste it from there. As I'm here already, what I'm going to do is grab this connection string from this page, from the Microsoft blogs page, copy that to the clipboard, and then finally get back to my module in my VB editor and then paste in what I've just copied between those double quotes. Annoyingly, it pastes the line break as well, so I'm just going to backspace this second line and get rid of the extra double quote. And then just so that you'll be able to read what's going on here, I'm going to break this connection string into its various component parts. So I'm going to use the space underscore continuation character in VBA so that I can break it up into the provider name and then concatenate that with another new line, and then the server name and the instance name, and then concatenate that with another underscore, and then the database, And then the last little part here, the trusted connection equals yes. So if I've got my little ampersand there at the end, do beg your pardon. There we go. So there's my full connection string, but hopefully now you can read the whole thing. Now, obviously, we'll need to make some changes to make this relevant to the particular server and instance and database that we want to connect to. The server name, first of all, if you followed along with the videos which I pointed out earlier on for installing SQL Server Developer Edition in 2016 or 2017, then we installed a local instance of SQL Server. So the server name is either your machine name, or you can write the word local or local host, or even the shorthand version of that, just enter a full stop, which is a shortcut to the local host. The instance name, it depends on exactly what you called your instance of SQL Server. I have several instances of a SQL Server installed on this particular machine. One way to find a list of them, if I head to my Start menu, I can run an application called SQL Server Configuration Manager. And again, this is something explained in the videos which explained how to install SQL Server. So if I click yes to allow that application to run, and then when it's launched, I can have a look at my list of running SQL Server instances. Maybe I'll zoom in a bit so you can hopefully read these a little more clearly. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so I've got a named instance called SQL 2016, one called SQL 2016 Training, SQL 2017 Training, and even an old one for SQL 2012, but that's not running at the moment, so I'll ignore that. I'm going to go with the instance that I installed in the video when I showed you how to install SQL Server 2017 Developer Edition called SQL 2017 Training. So having established that, I can close down that application, get back to my Visual Basic editor, and then change the instance name to SQL 2017 Training. The final thing I need to do is change the name of the database. So my database is not the name of the movies database. The movies database is just called movies. And again, we have that video which explains how to install that in the SQL Server 2016 series, the WiseOwl Movies database. And there's a script you can download using the link in the description below this video to get it installed if you need to. So having configured all of that, all I'd like to do now is test if I can open and then subsequently close the connection to that database. To do that, I can say cn.open first of all, and then a few blank lines, and then say cn.close. And if I use the F8 key just to step through, just to make sure that this is going to work, when I hit F8 on cn.open, you won't see anything happen. If you do see something happen, that probably means that something's gone wrong. So as long as nothing happens, you can open the connection and close the connection, and that tells you that your connection string is working properly. Now there are several other things you can do to customize your connection string. For example, this part here which says trusted connection equals yes. This indicates that I'm using my Windows credentials to connect to the instance of SQL Server. And the reason I've done it that way is because when we configured SQL Server in this video, we set it up to use Windows authentication. If you were using SQL Server authentication instead, you might need to pass in a username and a password. And if you want to know how to do that, you could have a quick look back at the connectionstrings.com website. And then in there, for any of the previous versions of this provider, you can see that there's a standard security option where you can pass in a user ID with a UID parameter and a password with a PWD parameter. So you can just copy and paste that back into your connection string and then enter your credentials as necessary. For the final part of the video, I'd just like to quickly show that you can extract some data from this database using a simple record set. So we'll just do a very basic example of this and save the more complicated stuff for later videos. So for now, let's just declare a variable. I'll call mine rs as adodb.recordset. Then I'd like to create a new instance of that class after I've opened up my connection by saying set rs equals new adodb.recordset. There are many properties you can set for a record set, but we'll stick with just the absolute basics here. I need to say rs.activeConnection equals, and then we only have one connection available here, which is cn. So let's set it to cn. Then I can set the source for my record set by saying rs.source equals. And this is just a string. This could be a variety of things. It could be a valid SQL statement if you know how to write select statements. And if not, of course, we have a video series which tells you how. It could be the name of a table or the name of a view or even the name of a stored procedure in the database. To keep things simple, I'm going to refer to a table that I know exists. It's called actor. And again, the video which explains all about the movies database will show you the full list of tables available. When we've done that, we need to open up the record set. I can do that by saying rs.open, and then a little later on I'll need to say rs.close to make sure it gets closed down again. Just to test this, we can use the F8 key to step through again. So if I quickly step through up to the point where I set the connection for my record set its source, and then when I choose to open it by pressing the F8 key, as long as nothing appears to happen, that's a really good sign. If something happens, then it probably means something's gone wrong. So we can close down the record set by pressing F8 and then the connection, and then end the subroutine. The last thing I need to do is take the data out of the record set and write it into the worksheet. Currently opening the record set does nothing to the Excel worksheet, of course. Now there are several ways you can get the data out of the record set and write it into a worksheet. I'll go with the simplest possible technique just for demonstration purposes. A range object in Excel has a wonderful method called copy from record set. So if I said, for example, range A1 dot, then look for the copy from record set method, followed by a space, there's a single compulsory parameter called data as unknown. And what this parameter wants is a reference to a record set object. The data type is set to unknown because until you've referenced the ActiveX data objects library, the record set type or class isn't available to Excel. So it has to be listed as unknown because the copy from record set method is defined in the Excel library and the record set class is defined in the ActiveX data objects library. Anyway, that's the simplest possible technique I could use to make this work. So at this point, I'm just going to click the play or run button. And then if I look back in the Excel worksheet, there's all my data written out into a simple table in an Excel worksheet. Okay, well that brings you up to date with the basic technique for connecting to SQL Server using the new MSOLEDBSQL driver. Of course, we've only done some very basic things here. There's plenty more you could do with that connection, as described in the other videos we have in the Excel VBA series, and we'll have some future videos which use this same technique to connect. But for now, that should bring you up to date. Thanks for watching. See you next time.